The last time I saw you, we were standing at one of the longest bars I think I've ever seen in my life.
That is right.
You remember it?
I remember it very well, Jeremy, and it was in Hong Kong.
You're
At
absolutely
the
right.
airport, you've got the name, I can't remember that name.
Czech Lapcock.
Uh-huh.
Czech Lapcock
Yeah.
Airport, the Cathay Pacific Business Class Lounge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have to say, Hong Kong now has become the financial centre of the world. It used to be London, now it's Hong Kong, because the whole movement of the world economy is towards the east, and Hong Kong is at the centre. It boasts the largest Ferrari showroom in the world.
You're kidding? Really?
You can drive your Ferrari at 20 kilometres an hour.
Exactly. Yeah. What a waste of a Ferrari. So is that where it's going?
Yeah, absolutely, because during the recession, you know, the large money flows happened through China, through Hong Kong, to obviously other countries in the East, but also to Western economies. Whereas, of course, the whole of Europe froze when Lehman Brothers crashed. So, yeah, the monetary volumes have definitely moved east. And to the extent that Macau, for example, on good days, has the same volume of gambling as Las Vegas. So, you know, we're talking that money has moved east.
Okay, let's do some scenario planning here, and let's sort of go from big to small. Let's start with the world. Let's then sort of come back to Africa, and then let's come back to South Africa, so we can scope in over this time. What is, in your view, is the sort of world scenario? Are things like the euro? Is there going to be a collapse there? I mean, we've just seen the problems in Ireland. They're now mooting Spain.
Yeah. Yeah, we've seen a flip-flop in the world. It's Chantal Aubry, with whom I work with, we call it the ultraviolet scenario. It's where you have basically a flat, tough U for advanced economies like Europe and America and Japan for the next 5 years. Meanwhile, you have China, India, Africa and South America basically recovering and growing at 3 times the pace that Europe and America is. So the whole game changes, where in future it'll be risky investing your money in Europe. You're going to have to invest your money in emerging economies and, of course, companies that service emerging economies.
That's almost becoming a bit of a bizarre situation, where you're putting money into places where there is more risk than the more stable places, because there's just no growth.
Yeah, I mean, but it depends what you define as risk, Jeremy. Sure, you know, Britain has had hundreds of years of democracy, and so have many European countries, and so has America. But in the end, you're investing in industries. And you have to say to yourself now, what does Europe produce that the rest of the world wants? And sure, Germany is still a world-class economy. They're the second largest exporter in the world after China. They produce BMWs, Mercedes and everything else. But ask yourself about Greece. Why is Greece in such problems? It's because, you know, go to Greece to see the Parthenon. It produces olive oil. But most of the industries that Europe used to have basically gone to India and China. So they're in a problem because there is this seismic shift in the world in terms of competitiveness of industry.
Do you think they will ever be able to get that back? Or is it has the worm turned?
Well, you know what? The Romans never made them back, nor did the Greeks. The Chinese, funnily enough, they were the top economy in the world for 1,000 years, from 400 AD to 1400 AD. As one Chinese professor said to me, we've now had 600 years of a brief intermission. And now we're back.
Now they're back.
So China is probably the first nation to actually make it back, having gone down the charts. But I don't know whether Europe is going to make it back. Certainly Germany will remain world class. And sure, it'll still be very nice to live in Europe. But whether they will ever have the kind of industrial clout that they had in the middle of the last century, it's difficult to say that it'll ever come again.
So this whole swing to China, how does that affect, let's then bring it back to Africa, because we are the resource base of China,
Yeah.
quite honestly. How is this going to affect us?
Well, I did a session at the Central Party School in Beijing in April 2006, and I remember one of the professors there calling Africa our continent of choice. Because firstly, he said, they have the minerals, which we really want, and we're prepared to, build infrastructure in Africa in exchange for long-term supply of those minerals. But second, he said, the West has abandoned Africa and we're filling the vacuum. So they have been all over Africa like a rash in the last 5 years. They're doing deals everywhere. The West has woken up to that and they're coming back into Africa. But it's not that I think Africa is going to become a Chinese colony. Chinese want to do the deals. They don't want to impose their language and all that kind of stuff here. So my advice to African countries is negotiate hard. They want your minerals, but you must actually negotiate to say to the Chinese, what extra industries can you add in our country so that when the minerals are exhausted, we are still a sustainable economy. So it's good for Africa that the Chinese have become so interested.
We'll come back to the resources in a moment, but let's focus on another aspect of that possible relationship between China and Africa. And you've got to look at the political arrangement, because are we not in a situation where it could be dangerous in some countries because the Chinese are prepared to overlook certain indiscretions where the West would possibly not have done so?
Yeah. Look, the Chinese have never really invaded other parts of the world. Of course, there's a problem with Tibet and there's a problem with Taiwan, but they've never been empire builders in the sense of Europeans. I mean, neither of the Americans. But so I don't think that the Chinese have some sort of great plan to take over Africa. But of course, what you have to be cautious of is the fact that the rules of the game for doing business in China are very different to doing business in the West. For example, they don't have a time value of money. They will invest in Africa strategically because they want the oil. And when a Western oil company comes along and says, I'd like to bid for those rights or for the supply of oil, they can't offer half the price that the Chinese offer because for China it's a strategic decision as opposed to a commercial decision. So in that sense, they are changing the rules of doing business in Africa. But I don't think it's really dangerous for African countries to do business with China. There are very few Chinese soldiers in Africa. I hear there's a few around the oil fields in Sudan, but they haven't sent their soldiers in.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that for the politics of Africa, if China is prepared to overlook indiscretions by politicians because they want those resources and they're still backing those governments, we could get ourselves into a bit of a hole.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. They're obviously more tolerant of dictatorships and I think than the West is. But what I hope about Africa is that it is coming out of that terrible state of governance which it was since the independence of the first African country back in the middle of the last century. We are seeing, a sea change and, more democracy in Africa, better governance coming. And I just hope over the next 50 years, the fact that Africa is going to probably do very well economically will lead to the kind of political changes that the West wants. And by promoting economic growth in Africa, the Chinese will actually be creating better political governance in Africa.
Who then, in this whole new scenario, are our main competitors? Are we competing now against South America?
No, look, my point about a nation is this, is you've got to find the sort of special spaces where you have strengths, because that's the only way you can compete in the world. And I've always said South Africa particularly has three spaces. We're still mineral rich. We've declined in gold production, diamond production. We're still number one in platinum, chrome, manganese, lots of high-grade iron ore, lots of coal. We've obviously got to add value to those resources. Secondly, tourism. I mean, tourism could be an enormous industry in South Africa, particularly after the way we handled the World Cup. And we're cheap. Despite the strengthening of the rand, we're still a cheap and beautiful tourist destination. I've been to Sun City over the last month twice, and it's amazing how many Chinese are now going to Sun City. They've obviously got a special deal going on with Beijing, but the fact is, it is an obvious area. And the third space is being the gateway into Africa, and that is the best space of all. Africa is now rated the third fastest growing economic region in the world after China and India. It's ahead of South America. We're the largest player in Africa. We're 30% of Africa's GDP, with a little less than 5% of Africa's population. We're the America of Africa. We've got the technology, we've got the skills. We are the gateway into Africa. And that probably is the most important and thrilling space to be. It's much better being South Africa in Africa than Germany and Europe, surrounded by elderly, indebted neighbours.
Okay, well, let's then look at that. What do we need to start doing to capitalize on these assets that we're sitting on?
Well, you know, I personally think something like the Walmart deal is a good deal for South Africa, because the reason Walmart wants to move into South Africa and take over Massmart is not so much for the South African market, it's to establish a base in Africa and then, you know, make Walmarts available across the whole continent. Because what's happening is, in this two-speed ultraviolet world, the growth prospects in America have diminished hugely for a company like Walmart. So they've got to grow their earnings elsewhere. And Africa is absolutely a continent to be. And lots of other American and European and Japanese companies are going to follow. And so for us, we've got to present an acceptable, attractive and welcoming environment to people from overseas to set up business in South Africa, to basically expand their campaign into Africa.